So, this is another kind of look at complaints, or a complaint that goes back several years. It's one of the first complaints we did, and I'm not going to mention which council it's with. We've kind of dealt with about a dozen or so councils, and all but one of them broke the law. The one that didn't was Aylesbury Vale. If you're interested, they actually kind of seemed to follow the law as far as we could tell, so that was encouraging. But this is one of the kind of councils that didn't tend to follow the law, and we had a lot of contact with them back in the day. So point of these is just to really kind of be an example to frontline workers, and hopefully an encouragement to kind of help people understand what's in store for you if you do make a complaint, because councils don't like it. Bottom line is, as you'll see as well, they tend to deny all wrongdoing right up until the point the LGO gets involved. So in one sense, if nothing else, the important thing to understand is that you shouldn't give up. If you think you're right, if you've got a concrete complaint to make, keep going right till the end. So I've anonymised it. We're going to call him Richard Murray, and I've changed the dates. I've changed it as much as I can to kind of make it anonymous, but I have tried to preserve the time periods in between the different date entries, just so you can kind of get an idea of kind of what time period this happens over. It's about a year or so in total, but you'll see kind of how it goes around, how it dots around in the meantime. And I've kept as much detail in as I can, basically, without this becoming tedious or too tedious, let's say. There's an issue here of gatekeeping, of bad advice being given at the first kind of few contacts. There's a non-priority decision that needed to be overturned, or a minded to letter that was saying he was non-priority when he clearly was. And there's some other stuff as well. So, we've got involvement here of dodgy landlords and how councils use them and stuff like that as well. So there's a lot of different issues kind of mixed in here. So I think although there's some kind of headlines, there are some little bits and pieces in there as well, which will hopefully just help you kind of, shore up your understanding of how it all works, really, if nothing else. And I guess, I'll do the YouTube thing now. Please do subscribe to us. Please do like the video. And if you've got any questions about any of this, just put it in the comments, because I will get back to you. And so I think it's just a good way of actually learning. Obviously, there might be specific situations you're involved with, that I can potentially, try and help out if I can. Obviously, keep the questions anonymous. In terms of don't mention your clients or whatever, obviously. So we'll kind of get into it. Just a little bit of background. So Richard is a single guy in his, 40s or 50s. Worked in various trades during his life and has worked up until fairly recently, but he is alcohol dependent and does use a few other substances as well, but isn't dependent on them. And he's living in a slum landlord's property, basically. We'll say it's not the 18th of November, but around about the 18th of November, he gets hit by a car, essentially, is what happens. And it breaks his right thigh bone, femur. So quite a serious injury. It's not something, it takes weeks or months to recover from that, and takes many months to recover fully. So he's taken into hospital, I think, for around about 10 days or so. And he's then discharged back to his second floor flat. There's no lift or anything like that. And a couple of days later, after discharge, he falls down the stairs of his flat. Paramedics attend, and basically they raise a safeguarding alert, which is brilliant. From the point of view of safeguarding alerts, this is a good example of how they can make a difference. A lot of professionals don't, we hear a lot of professionals kind of saying, well, whenever we make a safeguarding alert, nothing ever happens. And you might not be wrong, because there's actually a very specific criteria under Section 42 of the Care Act. And a lot of safeguarding alerts you make won't actually hit that threshold, because the key thing is that they not only have to have care and support needs and be subject to abuse, but they have to be unable to protect themselves as a result of their care and support needs. So it's quite a niche. It's not going to be a lot of people you work with won't hit that criteria, but it's still very important that you make safeguarding alerts in cases of apparent abuse and self-neglect. Just because it gets it logged in, and it might open people up to support they wouldn't otherwise get. So this is an excerpt from the paramedic safeguarding alert. Patient broke his leg over a week ago, with mobility problems, walking with crutches, finding it difficult to cope with stairs, as lives on the second floor block of flats and there's no lift. Patient has fallen downstairs today, injuring leg again with head injury as well. Very concerned for patient and worried that a copia is setting in. So a copia is like a fancy word for not being able to cope, basically, not being able to kind of look after himself. Patient cannot mobilise properly, cannot get to the shops to buy food, is self-employed, now with injured leg, will have difficulty financially. So as I say, I've anonymised that, so that's not the actual wording, but I've kind of mixed it around a bit. But that's a good indicator of what information they provided. So I went to the council. We still don't know how the housing team got involved, whether it was the hospital contacted housing, whether Richard did, we're not quite sure. But basically, whilst he's in hospital, his landlord very kindly illegally evicts him and disposes of all his belongings, which is not unusual. I think there was some kind of historic like rent arrears. It was only a couple of £100. It wasn't significant, but essentially landlords often will take any opportunity they have to get rid of people. Certainly some landlords anyway. Some landlords are great, obviously, but so that's he's now homeless basically. And so whilst in hospital, 10th of December, Housing Solutions Officer 1, which there's 3 that we'll kind of see. I'll kind of refer to them by number because it makes it easier to understand. So they assess Richard on the ward effectively, and they accept a homeless application. And basically, as part of the assessment, Richard gives his mother's details as next of kin, but only as next of kin, doesn't kind of say anything else about contact with mother. And following that time was in hospital, a referral was made to a low to medium support needs hostel. But nothing's given to him at the time of appointment in writing or anything like that. So he forgets to attend it, and it's not actually clear how he was supposed to get to it anyway, because he obviously can't walk at this stage. So basically, the referral goes no further, and no effort is made to rebook the appointment. So he's kind of that comes to nothing. You've heard me probably bash hostels before. This is an example of where councils use voluntary sector agencies as a easy way out of actually accepting main homelessness duties. So it's one of the many reasons we don't like hostels, is they inadvertently become kind of complicit in gatekeeping. They become the kind of the go-to option for councils. Things like night shelters as well. Whereas actually, if they didn't exist, the council would have no easy way out, and they'd have to actually accept the housing duty in the first place. So looking at this guy on paper at least, and you look at some of the paper, it's never a full picture, but he's got mental health issues, pretty serious physical issues right now, substance use issues. He is someone who does not like authority figures, let's say. If you speak to him about that, he kind of gives some reasons why that is. And so on paper, at least, as much as you can predict anything like this, he is unlikely to do well in a hostel. Plus, he can't work. If he does want to get back into work and he does recover, he's not going to be able to work in a hostel because the rents are so ridiculously high. So it's just not a suitable option for him anyway. As with almost everyone, his best option is going to be settled, safe accommodation, either in a private sector with a decent landlord and affordable rent, or social housing. That's going to be the two options which give him the best chance of not becoming homeless again in future. So 18th of December, and as I say, because these dates ignore the fact this is near Christmas, because it didn't happen in December, so it's not like they weren't kind of off on holiday or anything like that over this period. It was a different time of year, but he's discharged from hospital. No temporary accommodations offered by the council. They had a duty. They had reason to believe he might be homeless, might be eligible, might be in priority need, and he'd asked them for help. So there was a duty to provide Section 188 accommodation, but instead, Housing Solutions Officer 1 told Richard that she would ring his mother to see if his mother could accommodate him. Richard said he did not want the housing officer to contact his mother, basically because the relationship was really strained. But the housing officer said if his mother did not accommodate him, he'd be street homeless. And the council didn't refer Richard to any other support service. So down the line, we kind of contacted the mother, and she basically confirmed in writing that the housing officer had told her, if you don't put Richard up, he will be sleeping rough, which is a lie. It's abuse of power, I would say, and it's just a whole load of things which are not good. Don't get me wrong. If the housing officer said to Richard, hey, we can provide temporary accommodation, but it might, it's going to be difficult to get all suitable stuff. It might be out of area. Would you be happy with us contacting your mum to see if she can put you up in the short term? If he said, yeah, do you know what, that's okay, then everything's fine. That's a legitimate way of doing it. They don't have they're not limited to Section 188 accommodation on its own, but it has to be in there amongst the options. So it's kind of a backstop. So it's a safety net for people if they can't find other options. And if you treat people, with some respect and some kind of, personal choice and stuff, most people, if they have another option, will take it. If they can stay with a family member, if they can stay with friends in the short term, then they're probably going to be more comfortable. But it's a weight off their mind if they know that if that falls through, then the council will have duty to provide temporary accommodation. 20th of December, basically, not quite sure how it happened. Another service in town, another professional service in town, saw him out and about, and he obviously kind of said to them that he's at risk of rough sleeping or whatever. So they refer him to the street outreach service. And so that's kind of, that was a good thing that happened. So kudos to whoever that was that actually made that referral. And then the day after, Richard's relationship with his mother breaks down, and Richard's told to leave. He informs the street outreach team leader, who tries for approximately 5 hours between 5 and 10 p.m. to get through to the council's out-of-hours phone service. The call is answered by the Housing Solutions team leader, and Richard is accommodating in B&B overnight, maybe for a few days actually. For a couple of weeks by the look of things. So he's in temporary accommodation. The council, rather than kind of prioritising the Section 184 inquiries and kind of working out whether they're going to owe a duty to him, instead they basically refer him, I don't know if that's the right word, they get him into a HMO, House of Multiple Occupation or Occupancy, which, it was kind of under the radar because this landlord was terrible. The council knew the landlord was terrible. There wasn't things like gas safety certificates and stuff like that would have kind of made it suitable or anything like that. And it was very, very unaffordable, which we'll come back to. And they basically said to him, look, you accept this or you rough sleep. That's the kind of choice you have, which again was a lie, because there was a very good chance, even though they hadn't actually made any inquiries yet, there's a very good chance he was going to be owed a full duty. So they would have had a duty to provide him with decent accommodation. And he wasn't kind of told that by accepting this accommodation, he would be effectively ending the homeless application, because what happens is, once he's no longer homeless, he's got a legal right to occupy it. The council will issue a not homeless decision, which is exactly what happened. I think it was the next day. So he's in the HMO, and he's getting some grief from other housemates, and he's kind of got whoever's living in the room above him, for whatever reason, they've probably got some issues as well, urinating on their floor, and it's kind of coming through the ceiling at night, well, all the time. But he sleeps rough most nights. And then, so it was the day after. Sorry, these records are a little bit jumbled. So day after he's been placed in the HMO, the council write a nice, quick and easy, not threatened with homelessness decision. And there was a bit of confusion because it was dated wrong, but there was some confusion to it. And I've left this confusion in here because it is a good example of actually, even when housing officers are doing a good job and doing their best, they're still going to make errors, and those errors can often be confusing. So in this case, the fact that it was dated wrong, we couldn't really make sense of why they had done that at that point. It turned out they hadn't, but that's kind of how that kind of then played on, because when we made a complaint about it, it turned out it was the wrong date, and therefore that element of the complaint wasn't relevant. And so a couple of days after that, so he's basically been told by the council there's nothing they can do. He's stuck there in this accommodation from now on. He attempts suicide, and he's admitted to psychiatric unit for an assessment and referred on to the crisis team. So, and I will criticise mental health services in this case. We often see mental health services, as soon as they see substance use on the paperwork, they'll be like, "Oh, this isn't a mental health issue. This is a substance use issue," which is, complete contradiction of what their policies and procedures say. Their job as mental health workers is to treat the mental health problem. If it arose as a result of substance use, that's not actually relevant. They have to treat the psychosis or the dementia or whatever, and they can't just say, "Oh, it's a drug and alcohol issue. Send them to the drug and alcohol services," because that's just not how it should work. But there's a lot of discrimination, I think, and there's a lot of kind of sort of stigmatization of people who use substances. It's changed, it has changed in the last few years. So this is like 2014, 2015. As an aside, if you look at the Domestic Abuse Act guidance, it is for the first time going into a lot of detail and making the connection between trauma, in this case domestic abuse, and substance use as a way of self-medicating. So I think as a society, we are moving away from this kind of, drug and alcohol use is always a lifestyle choice, and, you deserve everything you get. That's what we're kind of actually seeing in the Minded 2 letter in a little bit. But I think that is kind of getting less and less tenable for housing authorities to act on those kind of things, and mental health services. So he's attempted suicide. He's released now under the crisis team. And he approaches the council again with the street outreach team leader and explains that he cannot stay in his accommodation due to the violent threats he's been subject to and extremely unsanitary conditions at the property. He's seen by another housing officer, housing solutions officer 2, and a second section 184 notice is issued stating that Richard is not homeless. He's told by the housing officer that there's no point in asking for a review of this decision. Obviously, he was told that verbally, wasn't in writing. And the team leader witnesses this advice. Richard returns to stay some nights at the address, and other nights he sleeps rough. So bear in mind, he's like, 6 weeks, 7 weeks after breaking his leg. Not good for him, not good for his recovery, if nothing else. Certainly not good for his mental health. He then accesses the drug and alcohol service, and he's fast-tracked to an assigned key worker, which in this case was me. And this is how I found out about him and got to know him. I'm doing the assessment, risk of suicide, alcohol dependent, other substance use, other kind of physical health issues that kind of went back before the broken leg. And I'm very concerned about him. And I think a lot of professionals at this point, sadly kind of say, well, not my job, my job's drug and alcohol worker. I don't deal with housing. I didn't take that line. I thought, there's no one else in town who's going to be able to do this stuff. So we basically, we kind of made that happen. And so technically speaking, Just Us didn't exist at this point. So we kind of started the process of kind of getting a constitution and stuff, but we didn't exist. So I did it by supporting him directly, writing letters. He would then kind of go through it with him, he'd sign it, and he'd send it off in his name. So it's never an excuse to kind of not help someone just because your organization or whatever can't do it. It's outside their remit. For me, if I was going to get this guy safe, he needed housing. There's no point treating an alcohol dependency whilst he's rough sleeping. That is stupid. He needs a safe, suitable home. And in this case, I believe the easiest way of doing this is to challenge the council and get them to house him, which I was actually right about. So, we'll kind of go on. So we're now in February. One of the brilliant things about good drug and alcohol services is that they have very, very, very experienced, very knowledgeable doctors, psychiatrists, nurses, who have that brilliant combination of compassion and expertise. That's the dream team. That kind of combination of factors. And so we had that expertise on tap. So as part of the standard kind of procedures, he was going to be assessed by the doctor, which in this case is Dr. Connell, not his real name, who's a specialty doctor in substance use psychiatry at the Drug and Alcohol Service. And Dr. Connell isn't rushed. He spends a good amount of time with Richard, goes through his whole, basically his whole life history in the end. And he diagnoses Richard with PTSD. I've taken some of the elements out of this, by the way, so there was a specific thing for that, reason for that. Alcohol-related brain damage, an acquired brain injury following numerous cranial traumas, which is a fancy way of saying head injuries, alcohol dependence syndrome, hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations. I don't know what they are, but they're in there, and alcoholic hallucinosis. A history of self-harm, suicide attempts, and suicidal ideations also indicated. So this doctor, in his role treating him for his substance dependency, was able to provide some absolutely banging evidence that we could use for the priority need decision. And, in one sense, it's a great opportunity. It would be in your local area, if you can get access to decent doctors who are willing to spend time with someone and and kind of do a proper job, you will find that you're almost certainly going to have evidence of priority need just from basic assessments. So where we are, mid-Feb now, 13th of Feb. So I'd basically help him to make a formal complaint to the Chief Executive of the Council, which is kind of, when I rang the LGO up, I don't think he was supposed to tell me this on the phone, but he just said, look, mate, just write a formal complaint to the Chief Exec. That's the best way of getting things solved. Ignore the Council's complaint process. As I say, I don't think that was sanctioned advice, but he gave me that advice and that's what we did. So there are 7 points of the complaint. And when we started, I had no faith whatsoever that the council was going to be fair, and I was right. They weren't fair. So my approach was to basically raise every issue that was possibly there. So in one sense, being quite pernickety, and in one sense, making complaints about things which I couldn't definitely prove because there may not have been hard evidence of it. But I speculated that something was the case, and therefore I'd make a complaint. And the complaint was I don't know how many pages long it was. It was a lot of pages. This is when my mental health was not too good. I'll be up at night, writing through the night, and kind of, just researching it and kind of, looking over it over and over again, and just kind of coming out with a complaint which I thought was was as strong as it could be, basically as robust as it could be. And essentially the 7 aspects of the complaints were, so first of all, Richard wasn't actually told that by accepting the private rented sector accommodation, the HMO, he was cutting himself off from the assistance under the Housing Act. There was this issue, and again, this is one of the ones I was speculating on, but basically, because of the time, this was before the Homelessness Reduction Act came in. So back then, there was a 33-day limit to making a homelessness decision, a Section 184 decision. And basically, like several weeks into the process, given that it's like, what is it, like sort of 5 weeks-ish, you've got, so very close to that kind of deadline, they had not made any inquiries whatsoever at this point. And what they did was they shoved him into this HMO and then did a not homeless decision the day after. And that looked very suspiciously like their plan was to never actually really look into it and just get him off their books by getting him into a HMO, which is a shitty way to deal with things, and ultimately what happens is it fails through, and they come back again and they cost other services loads of money because of suicide attempts and all that kind of stuff that goes with it. The number 3, there's a breach of the Data Protection Act, because when Richard gave his mother's details, it was for the purpose of having a next of kin, and what it was used for was to try and get his mum to put him up for the night by lying. So yeah, again, that was a breach, because it was an unfair use of his data. He'd given it for one purpose and it was being used for another. The accommodation that Richard was referred onto was very poor quality, was unaffordable to him, so he had a shortfall. So this was going on the AHAS figures, the Association of Housing Advice Services. These are the figures which housing options officers used at the time, and they still will in some sense, although Samuels v Birmingham, which was a case a couple of years ago, has kind of made it less relevant for reasons I've explained elsewhere. But basically, he had a shortfall of £16 a week, which is a lot of money. So it was never reasonable for him to continue to occupy it, even on the affordability issue, let alone the urine coming through a ceiling issue and the threats of violence from others. Temporary accommodation was not offered on the 1st of January when the first not homeless decision recorded the home. This is the element of the complaint which basically I made it, and then we found out that there was a misprint on the Section 184 notification where the date was wrong. So in one sense, number 5 is not relevant, but I've left it in here because, as I say, often you're going to be relying on documents which aren't accurate because of human error, and it's just one of those things, really. Number 6, Housing Officer 1 coerced Richard's mother into accommodating Richard by telling her that if she did not accommodate him, he would be street homeless. And number 7, sleeping on a sofa. So by not housing him in suitable temporary accommodation and saying, you stay with your mother, they knew he was going to be sleeping on the sofa, and you would imagine that they would know that's not suitable for his recovery from a broken leg. As I say, it's a serious injury. It's not like a broken finger or something. It is a proper one, which if he doesn't heal up properly, he's going to have a disability for the rest of his life. Again, costing lots of money for other services. So that was the 7 elements of the complaint. 18th of Feb. So what date was that? So 13th of Feb, we make the first stage complaint. By the way, councils generally have a 2-stage complaint process, but I do know some councils have a 3-stage complaint process. It's just one of those things. To get to the LGO, you have to exhaust the council's complaint process first. And I very, very, very rarely see an upheld first-stage complaint ever. So in one sense, getting your complaint not upheld in the first instance is normal. Just go with it. That's expected. That's how it's going to work. But so the 18th of Feb, Richard is illegally evicted from the HMO. He was threatened at the accommodation by someone who appears to be an associate of the landlord, which is pretty common stuff for dodgy landlords. And then he came back the next day and found the locks had been changed, so he slept rough on the 18th of Feb. 19th of Feb, the street outreach team leader accompanied Richard back to the council to make another homeless application. The circumstance of the eviction were fully explained to the housing options officer, who was probably housing solutions officer 3. We don't know for sure, but they'll kind of deal with his housing application from that point on. So at this point, he's placed in B&B. At this point, he is now, the complaint's been put in. At this point, he is now treated lawfully, from the purpose of kind of getting temporary accommodation. So it's likely that first stage complaint to the chief executive, if nothing else at this stage, has got the council actually caring about what's going on and kind of actually making sure they don't make the same mistakes again. What we're talking about now, sort of 6 weeks later. This may be an issue of dates. I think it was maybe more like 4 weeks. So Richard was Yeah, basically housing officer 3, sorry, I'm just trying to make sense of this. No, it's not coherent. Housing officer 3 basically sent a letter to Richard saying that she was minded to find him non-priority, and so we'll go into that in a little bit of detail in a second. So this is an excerpt of the letter, and I will read this in full detail because I think actually this is a great example of challenging a non-priority decision. So basically the minded to, and going back a step, so minded to letter, before a council can reach a final decision, they need to give the applicant an opportunity to kind of refute anything that they don't agree with. And so, but that's why it's so important to get the homeless application accepted in the first place. Because once you have that, once the council has accepted the homelessness duty, there are going to be lots of opportunities down the line to actually challenge any skullduggery. So that's kind of, that's kind of how we got to this point. So the officer's writing, I'm minded to find this decision for the following reason. So you're eligible, homeless, but not in priority needs. So you recovered from a femur fracture, although you claimed to still be in pain. I love that language. He was still in pain, obviously. He's limping about with a crutch, and on conservative management or non-surgical treatment to help alleviate this. Your doctor informed us that you've claimed to have been prescribed an analgesic and/or tramadol, although there is no record of this and your GP didn't prescribe it. Now, I think in this case, the hospital had prescribed it and there was confusion about where it was. The bottom line on it was he was under pain relief. Again, it's not unusual when you contact doctors that they won't have access to the right records and they'll give faulty information as a result of that. So you've got, one thing I haven't said yet, in my experience, the homeless person is much more likely to give an accurate account of what's going on for them than any other professional. And partly because some professionals are dodgy and they'll try and protect their reputation or whatever by lying. But secondly, because there's just human error all through the system. So I remember one guy we had to kind of fight a GP surgery to accept that he was registered there. He'd been there for years. Just the receptionist had looked in the wrong record or whatever, or had been misplaced, and they were absolutely vehemently saying, "This guy, we've never seen this patient before. We've never met him." And when they found the case notes, it was embarrassing. He'd been under them for ages. But that's kind of stuff which is pretty typical. You just got to push through it. So, and he goes on to say, you do not require physiotherapy, which again was not true, but anyway, or other treatments. So we can conclude that other than some remaining discomfort, you appear to have recovered from this fracture. And then the second one, which gets a bit more interesting, you're seeing the Drug and Alcohol Service for problems with alcohol and drug dependency. Dr. Connell, a specialty doctor in substance misuse psychiatry, diagnosed you as having a history of seizures, cognitive impairment, and PTSD. However, this is amazing. However, presumptively, these issues are likely to be as a result of your alcohol and drug dependency, whether seizures because of alcohol withdrawal or cognitive impairment and PTSD as a result of heavy drinking and alcoholic hallucinosis, respectively. Lifestyle choices like drug or alcohol dependency are not considered priority need for the purposes of homelessness. Amazing. How many? I think the question for housing officers is in the course of your career, how many people do you deny housing to unlawfully based on this kind of nonsense? It's horrific, but it looks so civilized. It's on headed paper. It all looks official. It's got some references to law, and yet the outcome of this letter, had it not been challenged, would have been that he would have been left homeless again, even though he's massively vulnerable. He's just tried to kill himself. He's been in inpatient ward. The guidance says just on that, people discharged from inpatient ward are likely to be vulnerable. So it's incredible, really, that housing officers get away with this stuff. They do get away with it because no one challenges them. So I think that's it's a real kind of, it's on us, as the voluntary sector, to be holding them to account for this kind of bullshit. So it goes on to say, before reaching my final decision, I'm giving an opportunity to comment on or refute the evidence which led me to reach this provisional conclusion for the reasons given above. So let's park that for a second because we're staying in chronological order. So we got the first stage response from the council about the complaint was that nothing was upheld. They did nothing wrong, which is standard. As I say, don't get disheartened by that. So we make a stage 2 complaint saying exactly the same thing as the first stage complaint. There's no new information came to light. It was the same complaint restated for exactly the same reasons. There was nothing new to it. And then so that's the second stage complaint's gone off. He then, so with my help essentially, so I wrote this letter. So Richard responds to the Minded 2 letter with support of me. I would like to raise several, this is quoting from it, I'd like to raise several concerns that I have with this paragraph. So referring to the paragraph up here, so this kind of paragraph here. So first of all, number one, I do not believe at any stage that the information that I've given to you or you received from the Drug and Alcohol Service suggested I'm dependent on any substances other than alcohol, which is completely true. They kind of assumed that he was. This is an academic point, which it was, but an important one in terms of you holding accurate information about me. So one of the rights that we all have under the Data Protection Act is that organisations should hold accurate information about us, particularly around information that could lead to stigma or kind of distress or whatever. So if you're accessing your GP and your GP has in their records that you're dependent on drugs and you're not, then that is something which could follow you around. It could impact your life insurance claims and all that kind of stuff. So it's important that organisations get it right. And the last complaint about the data breach with the guy who was alleged to be a child sex offender when he wasn't, that kind of information follows people around. So it gets on their record, it gets referred to another agency, and they pick it up and say, okay, he's got drug dependency, and he hasn't. So it becomes a problem. Number two, Dr. Connor made it clear that he could not rule out factors independent of alcohol use, like repetitive cranial trauma that may have caused the grand mal seizures. Your belief that they are certainly a result of alcohol use is therefore not warranted by the information at your disposal. So he basically jumped to conclusions about a number of things, this included. Number three, you failed to list the acquired brain injury that I was diagnosed with that followed repeated cranial traumas. These stand completely separate from any alcohol-related brain damage, but you've failed to recognise it at all. Number four, so we're going to kind of really go into depth here. And the reason, I kind of know this stuff is that I supported people in these kind of situations, and I spent hours and hours and hours reading up on case law, reading up on, kind of medical documents, anything that was kind of rubber stamped by the government, because obviously there's been a whole load of research on self-medication for decades, but up until recently governments haven't accepted it, so you can't, it's no point using it, in my experience anyway. You can do it, but it's just I think unless it's kind of either a government white paper, nice guidelines, Royal Psychiatric Institute stuff, they'll just say it's not a real kind of source. So I'm just gonna have a drink, so I'm getting parched. So number four, you stated the following as part of your second reason. However, presumptively, these issues are likely to be a result of your alcohol and drug dependency, whether seizures because of alcohol withdrawal or cognitive impairment and post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of heavy drinking, alcoholic hallucinosis, respectively. And so this is the response. In respect of cognitive impairments, I believe Dr. Connell attributed this mainly to repeated cranial traumas, not alcohol use, and distinguished between alcohol-related brain damage and acquired brain injury. So ARBD and ABI are two different things, two different causes. In respect to PTSD, I'd like to refer you to the Law Commission's publication, Liability for Psychiatric Illness, a document which I believe has been used by judges in several homelessness cases and outlines in layman's terms information about a number of psychiatric illnesses, including PTSD. So this is kind of, at the time, this is the most robust kind of, bit of information I could find that would kind of refute what the housing officer is saying. From this, you will see that PTSD is not caused by substance use, but rather traumatic events such as violent assaults, road traffic accidents, or a loss of a loved one. From my history, you will note that I've been run over by a car, which resulted in my leg being broken, have sustained a fractured skull following an accident at work, and lost a father to suicide. PTSD cannot be attributed to alcoholic hallucinosis. It is entirely unrelated. The alcoholic hallucinosis is, however, obviously an effect of the use of alcohol. And then number five, you also stated that lifestyle choices like drug or alcohol dependency are not considered priority need for the purposes of homelessness. Not entirely clear what point this assertion is trying to make. It is, as far as I'm aware, true that substance use in itself is not a special reason under the Housing Act 1996, and so has no bearing on whether I'm vulnerable or not. Now, actually, that's me being clumsy. It does still have a bearing on priority need. The case law, which I'm referring to here, Crossley v Westminster, basically the judge said that alcohol use in and of itself or drug use in and of itself cannot make you vulnerable. But first of all, risk of relapse into substance use following kind of abstinence, that could be a special reason in and of itself. But also the guidance makes it clear that when you're looking at priority need, substance use is a factor, even if it can't make someone vulnerable on its own. If you combine it with lack of support network, kind of other kind of things that go hand in hand with it, it can make you vulnerable. And then finally, I think, as we'll see in a second, I won't steal my own thunder here, so let me just keep reading. The issues that have been raised in relation to whether or not I'm vulnerable are all medical: acquired brain injury, alcohol-related brain damage, PTSD, alcoholic hallucinosis, grand mal seizures, and suicidal ideation. It is these issues that you must consider in relation to your decision. So what I'm saying is, the court, again, you've got to disregard the cause of these issues. The question for the housing officer is, how would these diagnoses affect Richard if he was homeless? That's essentially the question. It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter if he's caused it. You wouldn't say to someone with lung cancer, well, you smoked, therefore it's a lifestyle choice. And you wouldn't say to someone with an eating disorder, well, you just need to choose to eat then, don't you? Because it's your own fault, sort of thing. That sort of stuff would just get battered away. But because people using drugs and alcohol tend to have this unfortunate position where it's still kind of okay to discriminate against them, certainly if you look at headlines and kind of general sort of social attitudes towards substance use, they tend to be like, well, you caused it, you deserve everything you get. That kind of ideology permeates housing officers' decision making, and it shouldn't. You can challenge it. So basically, I've quoted some case law here. So in the instances of case law that I'm aware of, that include substance use factors, so e.g. Pereira, Sims, Kelly, and Bowers, the fact that many of the sources of vulnerability had direct links to substance use had no connection to decisions to be made by the respective housing authorities. So Bowers was a good one in particular, where, if I remember it correctly, and it is an old case, this guy had brain damage as a result of alcohol use, and essentially he was found in priority because of the brain damage. It doesn't matter why it arose, and that was from the early 80s. So this isn't new. Housing officers should know this stuff. It was instead the effects, not the causes, that had to be addressed by the housing officer authority as they decided on the issue of vulnerability. And then number 6, additionally, to restate an issue I've already alluded to, you make no mention in the letter of the suicide attempt that I made in January and continuing risk that I present given the reactive depression I'm currently suffering with. You could probably split these different factors into 3, and each one of them would make him vulnerable. This predated the HOTAC judgment in 2015, when essentially the threshold of vulnerability was lowered even more. But as we'll see, this was enough to get them to accept his in priority needs. So I finalise kind of summary bit of the response. I believe you that must therefore consider the single effects of all my issues taken together, whether or not they're related to substance use, when you consider whether, if homeless, I'd be less able to fend for myself than an ordinary person would be, so that injury or detriment will. This is basically wording from the Pereira test, which preceded HOTAC. So you can ignore that bit. It's a slightly different test, but it's the same principle. It's the same kind of big picture stuff. I think that, reflecting on my various illnesses, I am in fact exceptionally vulnerable to harm if I were homeless, which should be self-evident. Any member of the public, if you kind of said to them, what do you think would happen to this person in this situation if they became homeless? Any sensible person, any mayor, any councillor, any MP would say, of course they're vulnerable. This is exceptional. This is not everyday stuff. So, late April, that letter did the trick. Housing Solutions Officer 3 issues the Section 184 notification accepting the full housing duty, the main homelessness duty, and they basically accepted that he was in priority need. So, as I say, the letter did the trick. This is how it should work. You give a minded 2 letter, you challenge it, you get it overturned. Mid-May, so second stage complaint this relates to. The Housing Department Director issues a response to the stage 2 complaint, that's a fancy word for, again referring to the 7 sections, an additional 8th one which I've left out because it was just not that important. None of the points are upheld. So again, stage 1 not upheld, stage 2 not upheld at all. You don't give up is the kind of thing here. And something I haven't said yet is, as I say, I will at some point talk elsewhere about the impact this had on me. I would not have been able to do this had I been doing it on my own. So the fact that I was doing it with my colleague John, and the fact that we spent a lot of time just kind of chewing the cud over this stuff and kind of working out what we should do, that made the difference. If you're doing this on your own, you won't. I don't think I'd be very surprised if you managed to get through it. You need to have people around you who are doing it with you, who are carrying the weight together. Not just kind of nice people who sort of say hello. You need people who are in it and are willing to put their name to it too. because you are pissing off a lot of powerful people. One thing I didn't mention here is that during the course of this period when I was working for the Drug and Alcohol Service, my boss got a call from someone at the council, probably the housing department director. Essentially, he was trying to cause me trouble, trying to get me sacked. Trying to say, "Oh, do you know what Mike's doing? He's doing stuff outside his remit, that sort of thing." Fortunately, my manager told him to piss off, but that's what you're up against. So again, I will talk about it more elsewhere, I think, at some point, because it's been a bit of a journey. But anyway, mid-June, Richard moves into his council flat. Really nice flat, affordable, safe, suitable. I think, if I remember correctly, it was almost a new build. I think it was like a refurbished block of flats. So it's just really nice. Vast improvement on his previous accommodation. Early July, so we write to the LGO, and as I say, these days I don't bother with long complaints. I just often my complaints these days are like two sides long. The document we sent to the LGO, it was like a GCSE project. It was like beautifully bound and all like laminated and stuff. And I think it was like 30 pages long. So it had like all the different documents it referred to plus comments. It just went into a whole load of detail. So July to November, there was a whole load of correspondence between us, because we'd then formed by this point, so we're now a charity, the council and the LGO, including the following letter from the council to the LGO. So this was kind of towards the end of the process, because as I say, initially the council tried to say they'd done nothing wrong. So this is like a senior guy at the council, I don't know who it was. I'm able to report, so writing to the LGO, I'm able to report that in the months following Richard's experience of the service, a full review of working practice, documentation and staff capability has been carried out. A full set of procedures has been issued to staff. Casework templates are used to evidence decisions made, and there have been staffing changes. If you require copies of the procedures now in place as evidence of these service improvements, please let me know and I'll arrange the copies to be sent. In my opinion, these service changes will help to provide assurance that case handling has improved since Richard approached the service this year. As I say, it's always worth making complaints. One of the outcomes here is that there is a review of procedures. Now, in my opinion at least, I think the issue within the council here was the culture. It wasn't necessarily the procedures. There were a couple of very influential senior officers who, as I say, they didn't see the law as one of those things that had to be followed. They kind of saw it as an inconvenience to be avoided if you can. And there were various kind of cases which, we kind of saw that as I say, I would call it discrimination, particularly people who, had offending histories, drug and alcohol issues, even into even kind of travellers and stuff. I saw housing officers boasting about gatekeeping them. Housing officers within that team would say stuff like, "Oh, who's on gatekeeping duty today, guys?" referring to who's on the front desk duty. So there was a real kind of just toxic, horrible kind of culture there, and I don't think this complaint in itself was enough to address that. I think we did, by doing many of these complaints, we kind of started moving towards that improvement. Mid-November, the LGO issues its decision, including the conclusion. I've completed my investigation and upheld Mr. M's complaint. There was fault by the council which caused injustice to Mr. M. I'm satisfied that the action the council will take is sufficient to remedy his injustice. So LGO's upheld it. So first stage complaint not upheld, second stage not upheld, LGO complaint upheld. I don't know if they upheld every point. I don't think they even responded to it in terms of all the different points. I think they just basically identified that Richard was gatekept and he was left homeless as a result of it. So in one sense, the finer details didn't matter too much. And then the council in the December, so it's basically been a full year. This has all kind of happened over. So they issued this apology. Dear Mr. Murray, I'm writing to you to offer my apologies for the failings in the service which was provided to you by our housing options team. I appreciate this must have been a very difficult time for you, and I'm sorry for the distress caused you as a result. I was very disappointed to hear of your complaint. Ensuring homeless applications are processed fairly and promptly is a vital part of the service provided by the council and a key priority for my team. It is worth noting that your homeless application was received by the Housing Option Service at a time of significant pressure for the team. I can reassure you that since that time there have been improvements in both staffing of the team and also the procedures the team follow. I'm confident that as a result of these improvements, the service failure you experience will not be repeated. Now, they were repeated for several years after this and actually got worse. So, it's on the council's officers. They are culpable for this stuff. That they're the ones who are responsible for their service working legally. And long after this happened, we continued to see very serious failures. So it's taken a long time, and I will probably talk elsewhere about this as well. In terms of the different things that have happened in order to, in order for things to improve. One of the things I think had to change was that some of those those influential officers of the council had to go. Until they went, there was no real chance of it improving. So, in recognition of the inconvenience which you've suffered, please find and close the cheque for. It was approaching £1,000. I haven't included it exactly, so you can't Google it. This figure was arrived at by taking into consideration the 9 weeks between your discharge from hospital and your subsequent homelessness, applying the housing benefit single room rate. So this was not an unusual way of calculating it, and adding another amount in recognition of the time and trouble in making a complaint. The figure has been agreed with the LGO's ombudsman, LGO, and the money paid is a full and final settlement. In conclusion, I'd like to repeat my unreserved apology to you and wish you all the best for the future. So, if we'd given up at any point before we got to the end, in one sense the council would have got stronger. Their shitty practices and their unlawful practices would simply have been encouraged because, there's no, unless there's effective accountability, unless there's an effective challenge from external organisations, they have no reason to do anything proper. As I say, I'm going to do more of these. Hopefully they're helpful. If you've got any specific questions, please do ask. And if you're kind of doing this kind of work and you've just kind of stumbled across the YouTube channel, do check out our Facebook group, Better Homelessness Practice, because it's a group for people who want to do this stuff and kind of get people housed. And it's a group where we can sort of share good information and kind of, answer what if questions and stuff like that. So do have a look into that. As I say, there will be more videos like this. So please do like and share it and get it out there because this information gets people housed.